Thank you. Thank you. That sounds like I'm enlightened already. You didn't mention I have 3 kids. That's and a wife. That's the biggest qualification for being a therapist, probably. As Margaret mentioned, this has been a passion of mine for a very long time, and an interest to try and bring the ideas of Buddhist psychology into the modern world. In fact, I think that's sort of my mandate or mission. Some things have come out about, people say, oh yeah, I know, I've heard about Buddhist psychology, and because a lot is now, at this time, when I first returned to the States, of course, there was nothing, really very little. And I returned in 1988. And I always had, with my teacher, Lama Yeshe, who was a remarkable man, very, very unique, very, very much ahead of his time. He passed away in 1984. We're still reading and following his ideas today. But he used to say to me and to other people that you need to be able to explain these ideas so that your mother understands them. And then I came across a quote by Einstein who said, if you can't explain a complex subject simply or clearly, then you don't understand it well enough. So people are very different, have very different exposure to Buddhist ideas. I want to clear up a couple of maybe misconceptions or not misconceptions, maybe earlier misconceptions. One of it is that we talk about Buddhism these days, at least we're involved in Tibetan presentation of Buddhism. So we're in the process of, His Holiness Dalai Lama was once, maybe was asked many times, but once by a group of friends of mine that, or colleagues of mine, that he was asked, did he think that Tibetan Buddhism was transferable to the West? And he said, yes, if you leave the Tibetan with us. Okay, so we have often we have to really analyze and dissect as to whether what we're looking at in terms of the Buddhist tradition, which we receive, in my case, from the Tibetan presentation, whether it's Tibetan or Buddhism. Lama Yeshe used to teach, and of course it's common now, but he really insisted upon us that Buddhism is universal. So if it's universal, then it means it's beyond culture. Okay? And in fact, if you look at the history of Buddhism, it's traveled to multiple cultures. I mean, a myriad of cultures. Everyone from West to Afghanistan, in the previous days, now it's all over the world, but to Afghanistan, as far east as Sumatra, Indonesia, north to Russia, south to Sri Lanka, and Japan, east to Japan and Vietnam, and really quite a while. And if you go to those various places, you'll encounter a Buddhism that's adapted for that culture. Excuse me. And so one of the things I need to impress upon people, or want to impress upon, not need, is that the Buddha taught for himself, the historical Buddha taught for something like 41 years. That's a long time. And when we think about Jesus, he only supposedly taught for 3 years. So there was in those days, they didn't really write the teachings down. What they would do, they would memorize them. And because the Buddha taught the same topic over and over again, and then he had certain disciples that were with him a lot, they generally would, and their powers of memorization were extremely good, not like mine. It's like remembering people's names is hard. As a result of those, 41 years of teachings, they condensed his actual teachings into 100 volumes. And those 100 volumes are sometimes thought of as falling into 3 categories. And those 3 categories, one can easily argue that 2 of the categories are all psychology. It's interesting, isn't it? All psychology. People think who don't know, okay, Buddhism is a religion, but it's really less of a religion than it's a philosophy, a psychology, and a science, you could say. The other third of the teachings are dealing with ethics. And why ethics? Is the ethics so that we can have a healthy mind. So it's all related to the mind. Well, the second slide says to beware of experts. Strange. Start off with that, huh? Well, that's sort of a disclaimer for me. It's for my, we're going to talk about psychology. Maybe some people are going to send some questions in. I don't know, but there's a little bit of a risk here that you might think that what I have to say is the final word. I think it's the final word on the topic. It's not. This is a dialogue, and this is an ongoing exploration. So what I share with you, even if I sound like I know what I'm talking about, I'm just a student, just like you guys. I just had a few years longer than some people. I thought about these ideas, but these are just how I understand these universal principles, okay? But I would say to you is the same thing Lam Yeshe used to say to us: you need to check up. Okay, you and we need to check up. Don't accept. In fact, the very first Buddhist teaching, I think it was one of the first I received, I was amazed because there was Lama Zopa Rinpoche. This was in Nepal in 1975, and it was hard to understand him. Maybe it was a PA system or something, I don't know, or the lack thereof. But I remember hearing in that first teaching that he said, he was quoting the Buddha, and the Buddha had said, don't accept what I say just because I say it. You need to analyze what I say like you would test gold. I guess you test gold with mercury and rubbing it. He said, and then if you find it to be true, then okay. Okay? His Holiness Dalai Lama in recent years, this is phenomenal to me. In recent years, he's done, his almost his whole life, but his adult life, he's had a interaction with science. He's been very interesting. It continues to this day. And His Holiness said a few years ago, he said, okay, if science proves something wrong in our Buddhist teachings, then we'll take it out. I mean, that's courageous. That's confidence. And there have been a few things removed. Now, I will say, what's been taken out were not what Buddha himself taught, but commentaries. There's many, hundreds of volumes of commentaries as well. So some of the old commentary, I don't know, by these great scholars and contemplatives, presented what was acceptable or congruent for that culture and that time, right? Because we're talking about the last 2,600 years. So some things I think that have to do with sort of cosmology. They found, he's only said, science has proven that the Earth's not flat, for example. So we should stop teaching that. Okay? So that takes great courage. You don't hear that very often, do you? And that's true. I think that's true, sincere scientific inquiry, isn't it? True, pure scientific inquiry is an inquiry that attempts to have an inquiry free of subjective interference. So that His Holiness is confident enough that Buddhism is authentic enough, true enough to stand up to that. And if it doesn't, then we change it. So the beware of the experts is more about, I worked for some years at the Children's Health Council at Stanford, and it was really intimidating. I was an intern, and there were all these experts around me. And every time I thought about having to give some sort of presentation or talk, I get so nervous. Do people get nervous when they have to give presentations? So I figured out something. These guys and women would give these talks. I go, God, they're so knowledgeable. How do they do that? They don't look nervous or anything. Maybe they were, but I can't do that. And then I realized, I said, they seem like such experts. And I realized that was the problem for me. The reason I was anxious was because I felt I had to be an expert. The moment you give up having to be an expert, you're not nervous really anymore. If you're willing to make mistakes, if who cares what if you don't really care what people think, you don't get nervous anymore. So I think that's what but beware. And also, I also think experts, one way to think about some experts or some expertise, it seems that they're experts because they stop learning. Like they acquire the knowledge, and then they have to preserve it and package it and present it. And so beware of experts, I say, if someone's not continuing learning, then I'm not sure that, anyway, in this discipline, we learn for the rest of our life. Also, modern psychology, sometimes we say Western psychology, which is probably not the right term anymore. I would say modern psychology, because Western means sort of European. They have psychology in Korea, right? So So what do we say? Western psychology? No, it's modern psychology. But if I lapse into Western, please, I apologize. So part of this series that I hope, tonight is probably going to be mostly, I don't know how deep we're going to go, but we can go, if we have time over weeks or months or whatever, years, we can go deeper and deeper. And that's my intention if it works out. Okay? So it's impossible. I think that when you think about just the 100 volumes that Buddha taught, and if 2/3 of those are psychology, it's a lot of ideas, hard to cover in one night. Okay, I did an estimate once. I don't know if this is true. It's just my own little thing. I estimated, because sometimes in the monasteries they do recite the 100 volumes out loud. They recite them out loud, and as sort of a ritual. And I think I calculated it would take 40 days, all day and all night, to recite the 100 volumes. Okay, so that's a lot. So I want to talk about modern psychology and Buddhist psychology. I want to sort of, look at, is Buddhist psychology even relevant for us? It's so ancient. It's 2,600 years old. Okay, and what is this? Is there a difference between modern psychology and Buddhist? Of course there are. There are lots of differences. There are similarities too. I want to, share those with you, and maybe have a bit of a dialogue about it. Although I'm pretty opinionated. I really try to be open-minded, but it's hard sometimes. So what do they have in common? So a couple things. What is the goal? Let's talk about goal. What is the goal in modern psychology and Buddhist psychology? Generally speaking, or just sort of simply speaking, the goal is the same, I would say. And so we're going to start from the broad and sort of kind of slowly distill it and become more refined. So the goal, we could say, is to be happy. Can we agree on that? Yeah. So people are going to go to a psychotherapist or psychologist because some level they're not happy. Now, when we talk about unhappy, we have myriad and thousands of different unhappinesses, don't we? They could go because you're not getting along in your marriage, or you could go because your children are starting to use drugs, or you could go because you have a lot of anxiety. You could go because you're feeling depressed. You could go because of just, right? Lots of things. Job transition. You got fired. It's amazing. But if you think about all those things, it's because one isn't happy, right? We could just basically say one is in distress, or one is unhappy, or one is out of balance. So that's what we're looking for when we go to a therapist or psychologist. And in Buddhist psychology, it's exactly the same thing. It's exactly the same thing. So we're not different in what people are seeking from these two disciplines. In Buddhist psychology, exactly the same thing. In Buddhist practice, whatever you want to call it. Okay? It's that something, now it's interesting because there's a fundamental principle there, if you think about it. And we won't go into it in depth right now, maybe next time. But the fundamental principle is that things aren't right. And one of the differences, again, not going into in depth, but one of the differences between Buddhist psychology and modern psychology, I think it's one of the differences. And also, please forgive me, because I do generalize. When I say modern psychology, there's many disciplines of modern psychology. So I apologize if one of them doesn't think this way, and I'm including them. Okay, but this is more or less to get these ideas out. So generally speaking, something's not right. Okay? So in the Buddhist tradition, the something that's not right is explored and accepted in a very, very universal sense. What I mean to say is things are never right, which sounds kind of negative. What do you mean things are never right? I just had a really good dinner. Okay? Things like that. I have a good job. I just met someone really nice. My kids are doing well. Okay, so when we talk about modern psychology, I don't think we have that sense that things are always not right. Is that the slide I have up there? No, no. Go back to modern psychology and Buddhist psychology. You're cheating on me. I've known Urs long enough to tease him. I tease him, I'm sorry. He does well with it. You do well with it. I'm abusive. I hope I'm not abusive. Okay, so modern psychology and Buddhist psychology, they want the same thing. Can we agree on that? Happiness. Let's start there. Okay, Urs. Next one. So modern psychology, what is the goal in these two? So what is the goal? Okay, the goal is to be happy. Okay? But if we start distilling it, how is happy defined? Let's look at modern psychology. Okay? So these are just some general terms. It's not exclusive by any means. But in modern psychology, we could say it's to be healthy. You know, I'm not feeling good. Okay? I'm feeling anxious. I don't want to feel anxious. Okay? Or, you know, we could say healthy too. You know, if the opposite of healthy is having some sort of active mental disorder, isn't it? In modern psychology, we could say. And then, you know, we could accept, yes, I'm dealing with anxiety. I'm dealing with depression. Okay? It's almost like a scale. It's almost like I'm out of sorts. I need to see someone. I need some help. Now, you're out of sorts could be because someone died. You're out of sorts could be because you lost your job. You're out of sorts could be you just can't be happy. You're out of sorts can be you can't stop pulling your hair out. That's a mental disorder, by the way. Okay? Supposedly. Trichotillomania. Anyone ever hear of that? Yeah. So that's a mental disorder. You know, there could be many things. Okay? So something's, what would you say that is? What's sort of the common thread through all that?
Not feeling good about oneself.
Mm-hmm. What about when you think about anxiety? That you would say that's not feeling good about oneself, or
And there's a lot of fear.
a lot of fear. Yeah. So it doesn't feel good. A lot of it comes down, we just don't feel good. Okay? Now, in modern psychology, I'll take a risk here. I think the goals tend to be primarily focused on temporary goals or symptom relief. Okay, not always. But if you're going to go to you're going to get referred, if someone's going to refer you to a psychologist or therapist, his or her job would be to get you back to some sort of, help you get relief. Now, what's changing in this, and I'll say, well, let me finish this thought. So then it's also about relationships. So there's a whole other component of psychotherapy, modern psychology, that has to do with relationships, doesn't it? It doesn't seem so much like mental health. It's more like relationship health. Harmonious relation, good relations with your kids, your partner, your parents, your coworkers. So in a way, that doesn't fall into the mental health, mental disorder definition, does it? But that's one thing that psychotherapy is focused on. Family therapy, counseling, marriage counseling, things like that. Occupational counseling. Okay, career counseling. I mean, there's a whole gamut when you use the word counseling, but we're talking about mental health now, okay? So now that what I was going to say was that what seems to be happening is that people do also go to therapists and psychologists, maybe not initially, or it develops over time, that they're actually they want to go deeper. In other words, they've reached sort of a baseline of mental health. I've seen this many times, but what people want is like, it's not, okay, they're there, but it's not enough. it's like they know there's something deeper and they want to access that. And it's very, very, for me, it's a pretty sad place in the profession that we are. One way sad, because most therapists I found can't give that thing. I mean, they can give something, but then eventually it seems people turn somewhere else. So what's happened with therapists is, think about it, is that they've become sort of like kind of like priests, right? So back in early days, people sometimes, I guess, would go to their priest or their rabbi or their spiritual teacher. I'm talking about pre-psychology or before psychology got popular. Is that right? So religion became sort of the refuge, right? Or the support. And if you think about Buddhist thought having gone to, just think about this for a minute. So it's been Sri Lanka, Nepal, Tibet, Afghanistan, Pakistan. I mean, over time, not necessarily today, but historically it's been in all these countries. Indonesia, Japan, Korea, China, okay, Thailand, etc. So in a broad way, if we were to analyze those Buddhists, the way Buddhism exists in those cultures, you would see something that has morphed into that particular culture. So the expression of Buddhism in Korea is not the same expression as in Tibet. Okay? And the same expression in Nepal or Afghanistan, right? So it integrated with those cultures according to the cultural values, cultural norms, cultural rituals. So as we look at the modern world and Buddhism integrating here, if you think about it, what is our philosophy? What is our base belief system? Is it Catholicism? Is it Judaism? Is it Hinduism? What is it? What's the sort of natural construct for West modern people in terms of making sense of the world? What is it? Am I making sense? What do you think it is? People know, I've been in my classes before, you can answer. What is it?
Science.
Thank you. Science. Well, another way of saying it, the rational mind. And the rational mind has become very developed, and as it develops a religion or a system of thought, which we call science. So you think about it. If Buddhism was going to make an integration with modern culture, it would integrate with science, or the rational scientific mind in many ways, wouldn't it? And that's what's happening. It's exactly and guess what? It works. No problem. I mean, problem is not the right word. No, it's challenging, but in theory, there's no problem. Like you might find in faith-based religions, there is a problem. Because it's hard, because the empirical evidence in faith-based ideas is, and they're kind of mutually exclusive, right?
Non-existent.
Well, yeah, I mean, one's based on faith, because, and the others we talk about is based on analysis and rational and experiential, almost measurable in terms of science. Okay. So that's interesting. So Buddhist thought is quite. There's no real big problem in integrating for us here in our system of thought. If your system of thought, let's say, is, I don't know, Catholicism, that's how you make sense of the world, you can still integrate Buddhist ideas. But I'm talking about more in terms of what is the default mindset for a lot of people, modern people. Not that doesn't include religion. Okay? Buddhist psych. So in Buddhist psychology, the goal is to develop a balanced mind. That's very different. Okay, I mean that's the not the that's the basic goal. It's not the ultimate one, but a balanced mind. And people say, "Well, I think I'm pretty balanced." Well, this is where it gets a little tricky, because we talk about balance in a different way. We're very picky. Very picky. If you find yourself getting excited a lot, we're going to be picky about that. Because we don't that may not be a balanced mind. Doesn't mean you can't be happy, don't get me wrong. But we start defining happiness different. Health. So happiness in Buddhist psychology, and this is a very important point. Happiness in Buddhist psychology is a healthy mind. We don't usually, I don't think people typically define happiness that way, do they? No. You know, it has happiness as maybe feeling safe, secure, successful. I mean, if you get extreme, then, I mean, just to be kind of mean, you know, a lot of people define it as fame, reputation, success, achievement, don't they? Maybe not in this room, maybe not people listening, but if you think of that, most people, it's about, what is it really? What is it really? So what it really is, it's not talking about mental health, is it? It's about something out there. You achieve something out there, and then I'll be happy. You know, if my kids are healthy, I'll be happy. What if your kids aren't healthy? It means you can't be happy? What do you think? Can you be happy if your kids are not? It's hard. But in theory, yes, you can be happy. In theory, if you start following a different paradigm. Can you be happy in traffic? Maybe that's when you can't be happy. No, I'm joking. You know, so we say it's the traffic, don't we? Don't we? So when you're in traffic and it's, you know, really bumper to bumper, where does your mind go? So if your mind goes somewhere that's not, and we would look at that, and we look to see if it's balanced. Is there balance? If there's not balance, then there's not health. So all of a sudden we're not healthy in traffic. That's kind of sad, right? That we can allow that external thing to determine my happiness. So remember now, happiness, when I say happiness, I'm using the Buddhist idea of mental health, a healthy mind. Healthy mind's a balanced mind to begin with. Okay? Okay, so the other goal, excuse me, the other way of talking about goal, and this gets more into the psychology of Buddhism, is the goal is eventually to have freedom, to be in control. Okay. And we need to analyze this. It takes some time, but because generally people think they have a lot of control. So in Buddhist psychology, the problem is we have no control. Very little, I should say. Not no, but very little control. So if you have control, then once you hit that bumper-to-bumper traffic, you're fine, right? If you have control, then when you're in the bumper-to-bumper traffic, you're fine. But all of a sudden, it takes long hours to get through it. And you get hungrier. And you get agitated. If you have control, you don't get agitated. Okay? You know, I'll tell you about control. One time, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, it was Lama Yeshe's protege, was one of our founder, and our present spiritual teacher of these center and many centers. So one time he was with Lama Yeshe, because Lama Yeshe's still alive, and they were taking short, relaxing holidays. They're on the East Coast, and a friend of mine has a house on a lake somewhere, in Massachusetts. So they went out to his lake house for a couple of days, and so they decided to go swimming. And so they were out. So, they waded into, there's, several people, Lama Yeshe, Lama Zopa, 4 or 5 other people. And they're going out and they're wading around, swimming around. And then someone notices, where's Lama Zopa? And they looked, and then I think my friend saw a hand above the water like that, and going. My friend kind of, not panicked, but, rushed over, and Lama Zopa didn't know how to swim. And he walked down too far. And so my friend, rescued him. And he just started laughing. Lama Zopa was laughing. He says, ha, 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 ha. No panic. That's control. Okay? That's control. And we can do that. We can do that. They've done studies where, the startle response, where they were testing meditators, Tibetan, I think almost all Tibetan. There was one or two Westerners too. I don't know what the country, Europeans. But anyway, they do this thing where you're meditating and there's some kind of like huge loud sound, and normally you can't, the startle response, you can't not jump. They kept doing, these guys weren't jumping. That's control. Okay? Another friend of mine was in the car with one of our teachers up in Portland, Yangtze Rinpoche, and they were in a really bad car accident. And he was driving, and I asked the woman that was in the car, I said, well, what did Yangtze Rinpoche do? Did he like panic? She said, no, I remember during the accident, everything goes in slow motion. And he's going, and he's just like the same as he always is. That's control. Okay? That's what we can do. So that's a healthy mind. That's a healthy mind, because I think that mind, if we were to, if we were to inherit that mind, I think we'd say we'd feel pretty happy. It's like peaceful. So here happiness is associated with peacefulness, contentment. That's healthy. Okay? On the Buddhist psychology also, last thing, the goal is it does have the focus on a better world. No doubt. It's just that the strategy is the better world comes from a better mind. And that takes a long time to get our head around, because we tend to think that a better world comes from sort of outward action. There's no doubt we have to act. And some actions are definitely positive and others are definitely negative. There's no doubt about that. But to actually have a lasting improvement on the world, it has to come down to the quality of the minds of the people. Has to. Okay? As long as the mind is agitated, angry, hostile, then the world, no matter what you do, can't really improve. Okay, so I have a question. So is our job, is the job of psychology and psychotherapy, therapy, to strengthen the ego or to weaken the ego? What do you think? What is the goal in, say, modern psychology? To strengthen it, right? What's the goal in Buddhist psychology? To overcome it. So that'd be like weaken. Oh yeah, control it maybe. Maybe not weaken's not the right word. So I want to tell you another example here. I'm not sure where this is going to go, but as Margaret mentioned, one of our jobs when I was living at the monastery, Kopan, I was never a monk, by the way. I just was a helper. And so one year, we have, Kopan is famous for having a 1-month meditation course. And it's very, very comprehensive, intense, great course if you ever get a chance to go. It's still going on. I was at the 8th course, which I think was actually number 6, but the numbers got mixed up or something. And so, like Margaret mentioned, our job was kind of help organize that course as well. And we have between 180 to 300. Now they have to close their registrations at 300. There's always 300 people coming through there now. And it's a residential course, and you stay there, and it's intense. A lot of meditation, a lot of teachings. And one year, and there's always Western retreat leader. Lama Yeshe, Lama Zopa, you would teach it all. But there'd be someone who would lead the meditations and do the organizing of it. And one year there was one woman who was at the course, and she had a psychotic break. And she started breaking the windows of the temple and other places and doing really outrageous things. I really lost it. So I was going upstairs to see Lama Yeshe one afternoon, and I don't know if it was about her or not, maybe. And I went up, and I was standing outside his room because I could hear that he was in conversation with the retreat leader, the Western woman, nun. And I heard them arguing, not disagreeing, that'd be better. Disagreeing, and she was saying, but Lama, we're a monastery. Everything we're teaching is about compassion and wisdom, but about compassion. We're taught that we need to treat everyone as if they're our mother. And he says, no, she needs to see a doctor. And she's disagreeing, saying, but, we send her somewhere, then, aren't we not doing our job? And, are we giving up on our compassion? And Lama said again, no, she needs to go to the hospital. Take her to Shanta Bhawan, which is the hospital. And bear in mind, this is like 1982, and I don't know if you want to take... Anyway, so she says, oh, I don't know. Again, she's arguing. He said, she needs a psychiatrist. And again, 1981, 82, in Nepal, a psychiatrist, sort of a one flew over the cuckoo's nest kind of vision. And so she's just fighting back on this idea. And finally I heard this loud noise. And Lama, I think he pounded his fist on the table. And he said, she needs a doctor. Buddhism is for healthy people, dear. Stuck with me, obviously. So I want to share that because there are differences. Modern psychology, it does offer some things that are maybe better than what we're able to do in Buddhist psychology right now. I think, it's not in the purview of our talk right now because I've been thinking about what does it mean to be healthy. Buddhism is for healthy people, dear. We could have that discussion some point. But I think we could just think about, healthy, I think, in this case, not being psychotic, for one thing. So she was going through psychosis, okay? And then I think about, so I want people to get that, even people listening, is that, Buddhism is not for Buddhist psychology is not for everybody. I don't think, at the moment. Depending on where people are in their life. Sometimes they need other kind of treatment, which I think modern psychology does really quite well, or at least better than what we've done so far doing in Buddhist psychology. Not in every area, but because Buddhist psychology is now starting to make inroads into, substance abuse treatment and, even psychotic disorders. But, at the moment, we can't handle that. So if you take Lama Yeshe's admonition that, Buddhism is for healthy people, then we need to discuss, what is the level. So we're talking about on a relative level, obviously. Okay? So before you get too, I think Buddhist centers tend to think that they need to help everyone, which of course that's their mandate. But really, we have to think about what that help means. We don't have the facilities to deal with every single problem. I don't think. Okay? So then it's assessment about, well, is this person healthy, not healthy? Obviously, in the Buddhist psychology, everyone is, in a sense, unhealthy. Everyone is in a sense of, I'll put in quotes, suffering. Or else, why would there be a philosophy, a psychology? So that's not the problem. If you have you do. Like we have, mental issues. That's not the problem. That's a given. Okay? And most of us, before we think about Buddhist thought, don't accept or don't even think that that's a given. We think it's an exception. And modern psychology is almost like dealing with the exceptions. But people want something more. They do go to therapy looking like they're pretty healthy, too. And they're looking for something deeper. Okay, that's a good point for Buddhist ideas to come. It doesn't mean that in Buddhist thought that we're presenting the ideas in a very coherent or applicable, accessible way. I'm just saying theoretically, philosophically, the ideas are correct. The philosophy is correct. The psychology is correct. It doesn't mean we're intervening well enough yet. We're presenting well enough yet. That's a work in process, right? Progress, work in progress, or work in process? Work in process.
Progress.
Huh?
Progress.
Progress? Not a work in process?
It is a process, but it's in progress.
Okay. It's a work in progress. You got to progress. Okay. I don't want to go back. Yeah, go back a second. So we didn't answer the question. Is it strengthen the ego or weaken the ego?
You said it controlled the ego.
To have control. That's my belief. But if you look at, and that goes into the philosophy, okay, and psychology, when we look at modern psychology from a Buddhist psychological or Buddhist philosophical point of view, there's some concern, okay, for healthy people, let's say. Now, why is because it seems that in modern psychology, the main focus is to strengthen the ego. Now, strong ego is a good thing, by the way. You need a strong ego in order to control the ego. It's kind of a dichotomy. But that comes down to, a strong sense of identity is needed to get rid of your identity. It's a really kind of paradox, and we definitely can go into that. I don't mean to leave it as this sort of paradox. But that comes back when Lam Yeshe says you need to be Buddhism is for healthy people. I would say Buddhism is for people with a strong ego. I don't mean big ego, okay? I'm meaning it differently. Strong ego often implies arrogance. I don't mean it that way. Okay? But one that is, you're stable. Stable. You have to be stable. Okay? If you're stable, then you have the equipment to begin to analyze the ego. Okay, and I'm getting ahead of myself because, I'm getting ahead of myself. Now we'll go to the next one. Okay, so, this is I often tell people, and people who've come to my classes know that I have an issue. My issue is this. I have many issues, so don't get worried. But this is kind of like a soapbox of mine. We say, like I say, okay, I'm a psychotherapist, or people say a psychologist. Oh, I have to disclaimer one thing. It said about ask the Buddhist therapist. And there's no such, I don't know if there's such a thing as a Buddhist therapist as a term. There's no degree. There's no license certificate, so I have to be careful. I don't get sued for, he said he was a Buddhist. I'm a Buddhist, I'm a therapist. And I think from a Buddhist point of view, Buddhist psychological point of view, I think it'd be nice to develop a program where people could get certified. I think it's not far off. I think it's be a really, my personal bias, it would be a very, very helpful thing for us to be able to train people in Buddhist psychology. But anyway, that's another tangent. So, but one of my soapbox is this. Any people here, any therapists here? Psychologists or therapists? Social workers? Okay. In your studies, so you studied psychology, right? And psych, what does psych mean? It means the human soul, spirit, or mind. I'll give that one to you. Ology means the study of it, right? And an ologist would be what, a student of it? A student of the mind? Can I say that in general? Tell me, what did they teach you was the definition of the mind? Did you get a definition of the mind? Either of you, any of you?
I'd say no.
You're right. I would say no too.
Cognition, your ability to process.
What is the mind, though? That's a function, right? What's the mind itself?
mechanism.
Okay, so it's the brain? Did they teach you that? Is that your, I mean, I don't want to pick on you, but is that sort of the conclusion you made, or is that what they taught you?
Probably the conclusion I made.
Right. So if, you think about this. If you're a heart surgeon, aren't they giving you a definition of the heart? I mean, an explanation of what the heart is? But in psychology, this weirdest thing is you don't get a definition of the mind. Now, you get some theories. And those theory classes are pretty brief. I mean, it's like maybe one semester. I don't know. I'm generalizing. They might, but generally speaking, you don't receive a definition of the mind, and then you have to see your psychologist. How can you be a psychologist or a psych therapist and not know what you're therapizing? Is that a word? I don't think it is. If you don't know what the mind... So now, granted, many sessions of therapy are not necessarily psychotherapy, right? They might be relationship therapy, okay, and things like that. But I'm kind of speaking to the overall disappointment I have that, if you're a psychologist and you don't have a definition of the mind, I think that's pretty scary. Okay, I'm going to have heart surgery. Excuse me. Before I go under the anesthesia, I want to ask the heart surgeon, do you know what the heart is? I think you'd want to know. People, playing with people's minds is as risky, as delicate as playing with someone's heart. Maybe more so. Of course, the heart, I guess you can die from that. But you could really mess up a mind. I mean, it's amazing what clients give to you. It's actually extremely beautiful, and we should feel very honored that someone's willing to go, hey, I need help, here's my mental state. It's pretty amazing. It's pretty amazing. It shouldn't be taken for granted. But anyway, going back to that, so psychologists, it's and again, I'm generalizing. I'm sure there's people going to be upset with me, but generally, there's a psychologist, I think many of you may have heard of him, Dan Siegel, who does most of the, at least published research on neuroscience, recent neuroscience. And I remember him saying that he asked that question, how many people, because he, excuse me, in his workshops and trainings, almost exclusively psychologists, psychiatrists, therapists, educators, mental health workers. And he had said that he asked that question. He says he asked over 100,000 people, how many of you have received a class in the mind? And he said about 5% had. And then he had to admit he thought that 5% might have been, they went to some Buddhist center or something like that. So it's an open field that we have to begin to, it'll happen. And of course, Western modern psychology does think about the mind. There are theories, of course, and but so yeah. Okay, so that's my soapbox, that we're psych therapists and we don't know what the psyche is. We don't have an agreed upon. Now people are, but there is not, and this I can say quite definitively, there is not an agreed upon definition of the mind in modern psychology.
Are you using mind and psyche the same?
Yes,
as
because the definition I looked up in the dictionary a long time ago, and psyche or psych, which psychology comes from the word psyche. It's there. It says the human soul, spirit, or mind. So yeah, it is a synonym for mind, according to the dictionary. I think that's why people that developed the field, psychology, was right. I mean, Freud back then, they were talking about mental health of some level. Okay. So when we have a theory of psychology, won't that influence the therapy, the interventions? If you're going to help people with their problems, Aren't you going to have, I'm not talking about if you're a friend, like, I mean if you're a psychologist or psychotherapist, aren't you going to have a theory? Is that so complex? Yes or no? Are you going to have a theory or not? Think about it. Think about it, someone who's doing therapy. What is he or she... Okay, so someone goes in and they say, I'm depressed. Something like that. So that therapist is not just necessarily... I mean, he or she is thinking right away. You know, you're thinking, because you got to be pretty... What's the word? Ready. So when someone says, I'm depressed, and of course there's more questioning and that sort of thing, but isn't the therapist trying to make sense of the depression? Is that pretty logical? Even as a friend, you're going to do that, or a family member. Oh, it's because he always yells at you. I mean, that's a theory, right, of your problem. And therapists are going to go to some deeper explanation. But how do we know the theory is right? Now, if you think about psychologists and they haven't received a clear articulation of what the mind is, and everything flows from that, what happens to the therapy then? Do you know what I mean? How do you do, what is it you're going to ask, and what is it you're going to do with this person? Whatever you ask or do is going to be based upon one's theory of mental health and mental disorders and their causes, and of course their solutions. Isn't that all based on a theory initially? Aren't you holding a theory? Okay, for example, we're trained as therapists, and someone who's not trained. It's different. So someone's depressed. Urs is depressed. Okay? And he goes to the person who's not trained, and then he goes to the person who is trained. So the person who is trained is going to ask completely different kinds of questions and different kinds of interventions, right? Based upon what? Oh, their study. What they've been taught, what their training is. Okay? So it is based on a theory. What is it do we know if the theory is correct? If they don't agree on what the mind is, all these psychologists and psychotherapists, it's a little scary, isn't it? Now, I'm not talking about, career counseling. I'm talking about mental difficulties, okay? When someone's seen someone for mental... Now, doesn't mean it doesn't work. Even your theory, one's theory might be incorrect, but it could still be effective, right? Could be. But then we got to get very philosophical and decide, well, what does effective mean? What is your goal? What's the goal? To be happy. So let's talk about that. So what does it mean to be happy? Does it sounds so trivial, doesn't it? What does it mean to be happy? But the person is going in, we're all seeking happiness. So has it come down to, so the happiness is if I'm arguing with my wife, so we go to couples counseling. Is that psychology? Maybe that's not psychology. Could be psychology. And so I'm not happy. I can't, for whatever reason. So we do counseling, and then we learn to communicate a little better. Like that. Then we're not fighting really as much. The intensity is decreased. So is that happy then? See, this is where it's tricky. So for us therapists, that we've done our job. And the problem is we've done a little bit, but we haven't got rid of the problem really. Have we? And if the problem is just arguing, we could say we got rid of the problem. Well, what's fundamental? What's really driving the arguing? Oh, that's a different story. Okay. Now, psychologists or therapists do try to go deeper. Okay, we'll leave it there for a second. So in modern psychology, there's lack of agreement in terms of what the mind is. Even some therapies minimize the importance of the mind itself. Okay, what I mean by that is when I was doing my study and my internship and then a form, it was difficult for me because I was so full of ideas of what the mind is already. I had studied already for 14 years or 15 years. And then I had to go into this school. And I mean, it was good, but I had to learn different ideas. And they didn't fit for me. They weren't complete. They didn't make sense. And so I gravitated towards myself. I really enjoyed, in terms of interacting, I like social constructivism and, that how things are sort of created through narrative. Okay? Narrative in terms of how we make sense of the world. And it's all very relative to one's experience in the world, whether through your family or through your culture, that sort of thing. So in narrative therapy, there's narrative therapy. One reason it developed was because the founders or the pioneers of this way of thinking was based on philosophy through the philosopher Foucault. And Foucault was very into power, how power operates. He wasn't a psychologist, but the psychologists got a hold of his ideas, and they saw that, this many years ago, that there was a real power imbalance in the therapeutic relationship as it was before. Okay, so one of the ways they saw this power imbalance was the therapist had sort of what they called, I think they called expert knowledge. Okay, so he or she has this knowledge about psychology. That thing about, so they all of a sudden, your issue gets kind of, how long you've been beating your wife. Do you know that question? The person goes in for something else, and they say, and then the therapist says, well, how long have you been beating your wife? He says, I'm not beating my wife. Yeah, so see, now you're in denial, right? I mean, this is an exaggeration. So you're in denial, so just let me know how long you've been beating your wife. So the point is you begin having conversations a certain way. Like they say, organizations and people move in the direction you have conversations. So if I say to Margaret, how long, she comes in because she's feeling sad that her, what? Boyfriend broke up with her. And then isn't there a difference between, how long have you been depressed?
A year?
A year. Do you have a history of depression when you were young?
Sure, when I was 7 or 8.
Right. Yeah, and how depressed were you then?
I'm just making it up.
I know.
No.
Otherwise, we need
Pretty bad.
yeah.
Pretty badly.
So your mom was really picking on you a lot at 7?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think so. My dad too.
Mm-hmm. So basically, then you've been depressed for kind of a long time then, haven't you? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you start having this story, and all of a sudden, Margaret's getting more and more depressed. Because it gets reified, okay? It becomes solid. So what if you had a different kind of conversation, right? What about different kind of conversation? So we say that people and organizations move in the direction in which they have conversations. So in narrative therapy, they don't talk about the depression. Not really. They'll talk about the history of the depression. They'll never say your depression. Because when you say your depression, or when I say to you, how long have you been depressed? The depression is then seen as part of her identity, right? You're a pretty depressed person. How long have you been a depressed person? Long time. And I will be forever. Anyway, this is a bit simplified, but the point is that in narrative therapy and other therapy, I don't know about in brief therapy and in solution-focused therapy, they saw this dynamic that would happen with clients. That all of a sudden they became disempowered through the conversations they were having with therapists. And guess what you do then next? You take medication, by the way. If you're depressed, since you're a depressed person, medication, you really need medication, especially since you've been depressed since you were 7 years old. Now, you didn't think you were depressed by 7 years old, but we've uncovered that you have been, haven't we? You see, I'm being very little critical, a little, what's the word, general. So I don't mean to offend anybody, but I'm just trying to make a point. There's different ways to see how problems exist. In Buddhist psychology, that's a huge difference. We see problems, we see that they're there, but we see them existing differently. Okay? And in narrative therapy, because there's a big reaction to that dynamic that Margaret and I just went through, because a lot of what narrative therapists discovered was what was called mother blaming. That mothers were often blamed for people's problems. Okay? So they decided, forget psychology altogether. Because any time psychology is used, it's used to disempower people. They saw. So they went to the other extreme, I think. And this was something that I have a lot of affection for, narrative therapy, I have a lot of affection. But the problem was, I like psychology too. I like the effects of narrative therapy, how it gets people to separate, gets people feeling positive. But I think we could do more. I think people have to become their own therapists. That's the goal in Buddhism. Okay, so modern psychology, lack of agreement what the mind is. Some approaches minimize the importance of the mind, like I was just talking about. And often it's rooted in understanding the brain, or neural pathways, which is part of the brain. Okay? In Buddhists, the definition of the mind, you can go, more or less, you can go to Japan and find a Buddhist scholar. You can go to Thailand and find a Buddhist scholar. You can go to Nepal and find a Buddhist scholar. You can go to Sri Lanka, find a Buddhist scholar, and ask each one of them, do you know the definition of the mind? In the monastery, the kids as young as like 8 or 9 knew the definition of mind. And all those scholars that you might ask would all have the same definition, more or less. That's phenomenal, isn't it? I mean, think about it. That's pretty amazing. Now, it doesn't mean that they don't have different approaches to the mind and things like that, but definition-wise, the Buddhists, because 2/3 of these ideas are focused on psychology, and psychology being mind, they're focused on the mind. They need a definition, a working definition. Else, how can you? If the problem is the mind in terms of happiness, you better know what the mind is. At least have some idea of how to discover it, analyze it. It's really also is pretty interesting. Okay, so it's central to healing. Mind is prime. So if we're going to talk about Buddhist psychology and Buddhist therapy, we are going to talk about the mind. We're going to deal with the mind. We're going to interact with the mind. We're going to analyze the mind. We're going to study the mind forever. Thank you. Okay? So in the definition of the mind, so there's agreement of all those countries, all those scholars, all those Buddhist countries. They're going to agree on generally the same definition of mind. Okay? That's amazing. It's central for healing. Mind is prime. It's different from the brain. So got to get this clear right now. Is it dependent on the brain? Yes. Interdependent? Yes. Don't get me wrong. It's just like the mind is dependent on the body too. Mind is dependent on the senses. It's an interdependent thing. It's not something that exists by itself. Okay? But it's not the brain. Why? The mind is the source of all goodness and the source of all pain. Okay. There's one text, one sutra of the Buddhas, and I just always use this as a quote. Everything has mind in the lead, has mind in the forefront, is made by mind. If one speaks or acts with a corrupt mind, Misery will follow as the wheel of a cart follows the foot of the ox. People are upset, rightly so, in many ways, I guess. Well, upset, I don't know if it's rightly so. People are upset about the recent political climate, things are happening. But can you imagine being courageous enough, dedicated enough, to start from this idea? Let me read it again. So think about the present situation. And many people, well, I think everyone's disturbed by it. Maybe not everyone. Everything has mind in the lead. So that means our predicament, personal, has mind in the lead. Has mind in the forefront, is made by mind. Okay? If one speaks or acts with a corrupt mind, misery will follow, as the wheel of a cart follows the foot of the ox. If we have misery from the political climate, one thing it's saying is that if one speaks or acts with a corrupt mind, misery will follow. Now, I want to be clear. I'm not saying this is the whole thing. But for a Buddhist person, more and more and more and more and more, it's a process, not a progress. It's a process where more and more one sees things from the relationship of the mind. Okay? Let's see if I have any. I'm going to stop in a minute. Okay, so the context here is Buddhism as mind science. That's amazing. What is a synonym for mind science? His Holiness Dalai Lama refers often to Buddhism as mind science. What do you think is a synonym of that? Mind, psyche? Science of the mind, science of the psyche, maybe psychology. It's pretty amazing. Okay? So mind science. The nature of Lam Yeshe says, of course, the human mind has both positive and negative sides. But the negative is transient, very temporary. Your up and down emotions are like clouds in the sky. Beyond them, the real, basic human nature is clear and pure. That's Buddhist psychology. Buddhist therapy is about getting in touch with the clear and pure mind that we all have. Okay, and then developing that. What's in the way? Mental disorders, which are referred to in Buddhist psychology as the afflictions or disturbing emotions or delusions. And I have more on that for next time, unless we don't have any questions. But so bear in mind that just like modern psychology, which calls them mental disorders, Buddhism can call them mental disorders or afflictions is a traditional afflicted minds. This is the point, is I don't hear this in modern psychology, maybe they say it. In Buddhist psychology, these afflicted minds, which are things like anger and jealousy and pride and anxiety and depression, are not our true nature. They're not really what, just like if you think of the sky, or sky as space, and there's clouds in the sky, we know that the clouds are not the sky, are they? They're separate from them. They're interdependent, but they're not the sky. So it's really a misnomer to say, oh, the sky is really cloudy today. Right? It's not really accurate. There are clouds in the sky. The sky is not cloudy. But one of its qualities is clear